Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our program on the White River, below the surface, the aquatic life and water environment of the White River. We're pleased to have a great roster of presenters from the Department of Environmental Management, the Indiana DNR, and the Muncie Bureau of Water Quality, all provide a brief introduction here, and then we'll turn it over to our presenters. Just format-wise, we're going to have presentations from Drew, Kevin, and Sandy, and that'll go on for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a question and answer for about 30 minutes after that. So please stay around, and we'll take as many of your questions as we can. And I would like to quickly recognize our co-sponsors of the event, the White River Alliance, Two Forks Guide Service, the Indiana DNR, White River Watchers, Friends of White River, Heart of the River, and Robert Cooper Audubon Society. And just start off with a, before I introduce Drew, start off with a quick river quote from John Daniel, writing in Oregon Rivers. "We are never far from the lilt and swirl of living water. Whether to fish or swim or paddle, or only to stand and gaze, to glance as we cross a bridge, all of us are drawn to rivers, all of us happily submit to their spell. We need their familiar mystery. We need their fluent lives interflowing with our own." So with that inspiration to start off, I'd like to introduce Drew Holloway. Drew is a fisheries biologist at the Bureau of Water Quality within the Muncie Sanitary District. This is one of the oldest water pollution testing and enforcement agencies in the United States. So Drew, welcome, and please take it away.
All right, well, thank you, Tim, for the introduction. And before we jump into the PowerPoint, everyone, I just wanted to give a quick acknowledgement to my co-presenters today. We have Sandy Clark-Kolaks, who is a fisheries research biologist with the Indiana Department of Natural Resources, and Kevin Gaston, who is a senior environmental manager in the probabilistic monitoring section for the Indiana Department of Environmental Management. All right. And then Kevin, if you want to get this screen pulled up. All right, looks like we need permission from you, Jenny, to put the screen up. There we go. Okay. All right, well, again, like I said, thank you guys for everything and having us out today. Before I go sort of any further with this project, the two other organizations that were with us that helped, the IDNR and IDEM, this is a first of its kind project. So when we actually look at this is one of the only studies that we know of in most comprehensive study of one water body in Indiana in its history. So this is a big undertaking, and something that without all three of these government organizations working together, there's no way that we could have got this accomplished. So I just wanted to kind of start with that to let you guys know just how much went into this. And you'll see as we go along just what exactly it meant to have these groups working together. And at the end of the presentation, there's a slide that acknowledges every single person that helped with it. And it's really a comprehensive list. So I think you guys will realize that, you know, your natural resources are in good hands as we are really looking into this stuff and really monitoring to the best of our ability. All right, next slide, Kevin. And then here's a slide just with our names and our titles again. At the end or on our webpage that is highlighted at the end of this presentation, you will be able to contact us if you have any further questions, even after the questions and comment section that you'll see featured today. All right, next slide. All right, so we wanted to start with a little bit of quick facts and a little bit of history on the West Fork and the main stem of the White River. For those of you unfamiliar, the river does start in rural Randolph County near Lynn, Indiana. And that first picture that you see on top, where it looks like a very small stream, is actually where the White River sort of comes out of the ground. So if you're looking at this photo, I'm standing on a culvert on a bridge, and if I were to turn around 180 degrees, I would see cornfields. So it's definitely sort of a bizarre scene to see that and know that that's where the White River begins. But if you look at that bottom picture, at that point, the river we're almost to mile marker 405, which is how long the main stem is. And it has a total drainage area of 5,367 square miles. And if you look at that picture, you can see how large the river gets by the time we get almost to that Illinois border. So I have mentioned there that as a checkered past, and I will be the first one to admit that is a sort of a cheap joke, kind of using the Indy 500 as a pun, but it does sort of give you the sense of its history. So believe it or not, the issues that the White River has been experiencing have been going on since the placement of the state's capital in Indianapolis in 1820, 1821. And in a document from J.P. Dunn written in 1910 on Indianapolis history, they say that the capital is to be placed at the center of a state with access to a navigable stream. So to them, that was the White River and Fall Creek in that area. They wanted to use it for things like transportation, things like that, which not a lot of them panned out for them, but it is interesting that they decided to use Indianapolis in that area on the White River. And it's obviously no surprise that other cities followed suit around Indiana. And there's an article from W.M. Tucker from 1922, and he states that 6% or 2 of the 33 principal cities in the White River Basin had some sort of wastewater treatment. So that's kind of an interesting thing to think about, that only 2 of these first cities in Indiana were able to do something with their waste. And to kind of wrap that all up, there was an article in the Indianapolis Star on September 23rd, 2019. And the quote from it that I pulled is, "At a time the city's population was booming and the sewage problems that went with it. The problem had grown so bad that farmers in Morgan and Johnson counties actually sued the city." And this is my favorite part. "Back then, industry was also required by law to discharge wastewater directly into the river." So you think about how far we've come from things like that, and to know that that's just how it was handled previously, is that it was just directly to be put in there. And the last bullet point there, the timing of these anthropogenic or human-caused events have led authors like James Gammon to believe that some of these initial fish surveys that were done in Indiana, the fish community could have potentially already been altered because of the placement of the capital and using these rivers and streams sort of differently than what nature intended. Next slide. So 2 of the largest fish kills, this is just something I wanted to touch base on because of the pollution aspect of things, took place in totally different times. So the first one took place in 1896 when the American Strawboard Factory storage lagoon or pond actually was washed out in Noblesville, Indiana. And the pond contained this waste from a strawboard making process that used a lot of muriatic acid and some pretty nasty stuff. And they actually, when that washed out, they had dead fish from Noblesville to Broad Ripple. And it is fairly well documented. If you wanted to look that up, you could see some of those things online. But that was sort of like the first big fish kill. So before we go into the big fish kill of 1999, I did want to touch base with you and tell a little bit about the Clean Water Act. So the Clean Water Act was passed in 1972, and that's actually a federal law in the United States that governs water pollution. Its goal is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of our nation's waterways. And these strict rules put on point source pollution have led to vast improvements of our nation's waterways and the things that live inside there that we're going to be talking to you about today. But not even the Clean Water Act could protect us from the 1999 fish kill in Anderson from the Guide Corporation, in which they released their chemical pollutants directly into the wastewater system. And after passing through the treatment plant, made their way to the White River, resulting in a total loss of aquatic life for 43 river miles. And it's estimated that there were 4.3 million fish lost in this. Also, sort of in an effort to save time, I don't want to really dive too heavily into the Anderson fish kill. It is very well documented. A quick Google search will definitely provide you with a lot of information on that event and sort of the things that have happened since then. And I see that there was a question in the chat. We had a question about the date on the newspaper quote. Shouldn't it be 1919? No, the Indy Star article was in 2019. There was a really well done article put out in the Star with a lot of information about the White River and some of its history. Before I go on to my next slide, or before I pass it to Kevin, I'm sorry, I did want to mention that if you look at that bottom picture on your slide there, you can actually see some DNR folks that have done extensive work to sample, restock, and assess the fish communities in that kill zone. And in fact, some of the sites we sampled for our project we're going to discuss with you today are actually from that 99 fish kill. And with that, I will pass it to Kevin.
Thank you, Drew. So now you've got a background of the White River. We're going to give you a little bit of overview and some logistics about the White River Mainstem Project. As it's been already said, this project is a collaboration between IDEM and Indiana DNR and the Muncie Bureau of Water Quality, with it being a first of its kind. We also received some funding from the US EPA. This allowed us to collect water samples and send it out for analysis. When it comes to this project, we did 3 different types of sampling. We did water chemistry sampling, fish community sampling, and benthic macroinvertebrates or aquatic insect community sampling. When we started putting this project together, we needed to set a list of objectives so that each agency collected the necessary data to get their work done. So the following few slides, we'll be talking a little bit about these objectives. The first one being to collect samples to give a snapshot of water quality of the West Fork, White River, and White River. Our next objective was to assess stretches of the West Fork, White River, and White River that have not been sampled for many years. I mean, we've got a long amount of river and there's a lot of segments that haven't been sampled in a while. Our next objective was to collect additional data at historical DNR sites to continue monitoring and managing the fish community. After the fish kill, there was some sampling done in the Anderson to Indianapolis reach, and we wanted to go back and collect additional data to compare to historical data. The next objective was to sample stream reaches on the 303D list for possible removal of impairments. The 303D list is a list of impaired waters for the state. 303D is the section of the Clean Water Act that this list falls into, and we publish this report at IDEM every 2 years. So the analysis and assessments from this sampling effort would be published in the 2022 list of impaired waters. The next objective was to identify shifts in fish community structure along the river. As we go through the data that we've got presented in this PowerPoint, you'll see shifts, and we'll talk about these shifts. But we want to look further into the data that we've collected and look through the whole stretch of river. And our final objective was to identify how far invasive silver carp and bighead carp had traveled up the West Fork White River. And this is a question we get asked when we're out sampling all over the place. How far have the Asian carp advanced up the river? So how do we complete this project? First off, the 3 agencies was a big factor. Not one agency could accomplish this project by itself. It required a great effort between the 3 of us, and it gave us a lot of expertise on the river itself. Within those 3 agencies, 21 full-time staff and 4 interns assisted with the sampling effort. We had between 1 to 3 crews out in the field from the months of June through November of 2020. With doing this sampling, we used 9 boats, 8 electrofishing boats, and we also had to use the airboat that's in the picture on the right side of the screen. And we'll talk about that, I think, on the next slide. 2 canoes were used. These were both for electrofishing, and Sandy will touch base on that when we talk about our sampling. 2 electrofishing tote barges, and also 1 backpack electrofisher. So what obstacles did we face? We all know that COVID-19 has been a big problem in everybody's side this year, and it wasn't any different for us. With having the global pandemic occurring, we had to make sure that each agency's safety protocols were met. And with that, it kind of resulted in us altering schedules, making sure that the policies were met with each group. And this also led to some other problems, such as with us at IDEM. We are stationed out of Indianapolis, and we do at times travel and stay out for a week, and we weren't able to do that. Another obstacle we faced was drought conditions. September was recorded as the second driest September on record, and we've got a couple of graphs on the bottom of the screen. These are from a stream gauge just north of Martinsville on the West Fork White River. And as you can see on the chart on the left, those triangles are median flow. And when we do our sampling, we generally try to sample when it's at median flow, at least. And we got way below median flow, which if you look on the graph on the right, shows that at that gauge, it almost got to about a ½ inch deep for the river. So this kind of led to us having to improvise when we did sampling, and what we initially thought could have been a boat site may have resulted in us having to switch equipment types to one of our canoes or tote barge, or in some cases we even actually had to hand carry in a smaller boat to get to the river and to our site and do our sampling. Another obstacle we ran into was intern positions. We rely on interns a lot for all of our work. All three agencies do. I will say IDEM was lucky enough to fulfill the need for interns on our end. But at the Bureau of Water Quality, they were only to get 2 of their 5 interns. And at DNR, the fisheries biologists were not fortunate enough to have the opportunity to have interns. At this point, I would like to turn it over to Sandy, or actually, I got one more slide. I'm sorry about that. So what did we collect? We collected 259 samples. When we break those down, 180 of those samples were water samples, comprised of 900 plus bottles of water. We have 65 fish community samples and 12 macroinvertebrate community samples. Now through this presentation, we're going to focus on the fish community samples, and hopefully in the future we can talk about the other remaining sampling types. So now I'd like to turn it over to Sandy, and she's going to talk about our sampling methods.
Thanks, Kevin. So as you'll notice on some of the numbers that Kevin presented on the last slide, won't match up exactly with the numbers on these slides, and we'll explain that in a second. But I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about our sampling methods. So when we started this project, each agency collects a lot of the same metrics, but we may collect them a little differently, and some agencies may not need certain metrics. And so part of that was also combining our sampling methods, and each agency may have collected a little more data than they normally do, but we wanted to make sure we had consistent sampling. So for water quality sampling, it was collected at 60 of the 62 fish collection sites. As Kevin mentioned, it was collected 3 times during the year, once in the spring, once in the summer, and once in the fall. And these are done using a grab sample method. So the collector wades out into the river. They take the bottle, they rinse it out using the water from the river, and then they fill it. 3 bottles were taken at each site. One of those bottles, which collected the nutrients and cyanide measurements, are sent to a contract lab in Indiana for analysis. And then 2 other bottles are filled, and those are the general chemistry metrics and dissolved metals, and those are shipped to the EPA Region 5 lab in Chicago. And these are just a list of some of the metrics that we will be calculated, and I believe those will be posted on the story map as IDEM processes those. Kevin, next slide. So for fish sampling, fish were collected at all 62 sites. Kevin's slide earlier said there were 67. That's because based on IDEM's quality assurance protocol, 10% of the sites are actually resampled for fish communities to make sure that all the equipment was proper.
All right. Hey, Sandy, we lost your audio.
Can you hear me now?
There we go. Now you're back.
Okay, sorry about that. So we use electrofishing because it is effective for both small-bodied fish and large-bodied fish, so minnows, darters, all the way up to channel catfish and Asian carp. We make sure we use very small diameter mesh size because that makes sure that small-bodied fish do not go through the net as we are sampling. And so here's just some pictures up here in the corner. We have the backpack electrofisher. This is used in the smaller wadable parts of the river, especially in the headwaters area, where you walk along. At the end of this long yellow pole is a metal ring, and that moves the electrical current into the water and stuns the fish, and you walk along with a dip net and dip those up. Down here in the other corners, we have the barge and the canoe that Kevin mentioned earlier. These are, as the river widens out and we need to cover a larger surface area, we can spread out. We'll have multiple people with the electrical probes so we can cover a larger portion of the river. And as we're doing that, we would move up one shoreline, moving upstream, and then come process the fish and then move to the other side. And as we move downstream and we start getting deeper pools, the canoe allowed us to paddle through those areas and collect fish from those deeper areas. Next slide, Kevin. And this is a video demonstrating the electrofishing with the boat. And as you can see, the fish are just stunned. Our goal is always to return all the fish back to the water. So we dip them up and they go into a tank of water with aerators where they stay until we process them. And next slide, we actually have a video of what it looks like underneath the water. So you can see here the smallmouth bass just kind of coming out from underneath the logs. They're mobilized, and then within 10 to 15 seconds, they're back to life, or they're never dead. So they're, moving around again in the tank. Next slide. So what do we do when we collect all these fish? All fish are identified down to species, and for non-game fish, we measure the smallest and the largest fish of each species, and we take a total weight by that species. And then for game fish, because we wanted more information on those, we took individual fish lengths and weights. And then for species like smallmouth bass, rock bass, we also took scales so we could age them and look at growth within the river system. And I believe next, Drew will be discussing, we have macroinvertebrates. So at 12 of the sites, or 11 sites plus a resample, there were 12 total, macroinvertebrates were taken, and these are water insects. And this is done using a kick net system. So you jump out into the river if possible, you go along the shore, you disturb the substrate with your foot and then dip the net through it, collecting any macroinvertebrates are there. In a lot of cases, they'll do a quick pick along the shoreline to take out all the large detritus and rocks and things like that you might get. And then they preserve the sample for later processing in the lab. And next, Drew is going to talk about our habitat assessments.
Okay, all right. So for each fish site that we actually had sampled and macroinvertebrate site, we do what is known as the Qualitative Habitat Evaluation Index, also known as the QHEI. QHEI was created by Ed Rankin in 1989 with the Ohio EPA. And what's nice about this is it's a reproducible document, and it serves as a guideline to provide an overview of available habitat for the fish and the macroinvertebrates. And it's interesting because what it does is it allows us to measure these variables pertinent to biological potential. So we're going to look at things like the substrate of the river, the in-stream cover, channel morphology, so how curvy the river may be, bank erosion and riparian zone, the pool glide and riffle run quality. So that's going to be your traditional riffle run pool complex. And all of these things will come together to allow us to assess the river as a whole. Scores for these will give us a number between 0 and 100. Obviously a score of 0 is going to be very bad. I don't think that's ever happened, but they do produce a narrative score, which I'll go into when I start talking about each section of fish. And when assessing these biological communities, we can use these habitat scores to potentially explain why we might not see some fish species in the absence of a water quality issue. And that's because these fish are known habitat specialists as well as the macroinvertebrates. Next slide, Kevin. So for the fish analysis, we use what is known as the Index of Biotic Integrity, and these are regionally calibrated throughout Indiana. And for us, we use one that is comprised of 12 metrics, and they're going to look at the entire fish community. So this includes looking at things like the number of species, the number of darters, mad tom, sculpin species, how many sensitive species there are, how many tolerant species there are, which those are going to be pollution tolerant would mean that they can handle a degraded system. Sensitive would mean that they are sensitive to pollution, meaning they need really clean water to survive. They're going to be broken down by diet group and potentially also look at how the fish's condition is. So are we going to see something where we see fish with lesions or wounds or sores from potentially water quality or not habitat, but water quality issues? You can see these score from 0 to 60. Technically, the lowest score you can get is a 12 if you see one fish. So if you get a score of a 0, that's really bad to not see any fish. But if you were to see one fish, your minimum score is a 12, and a 60 would be the highest. Now, when we look at those scores, they're going to be broken down narratively, which I'll go through on the next slide as well. But for right now, we just need to think about how we're scoring these sites on 0 to 60 is that each of the metrics, all 12 of them, will score either a 1, a 3, or a 5. So based on those reference conditions that were developed for this regionally calibrated IBI, we're going to say if it is severely different from what a reference condition is, you're going to score a 1. If it's moderately different, you're going to see a 3. And if it looks like it should and it's a healthy stream, you're going to see a score of a 5. So that'll kind of help you guys gauge when we go into those slides about the different species, just exactly what narratively they would score for a reference for you guys' future. And then also, if you do have any further questions about the methodology that we used, when we show you guys a slide at the end with the story map for this project with all the information you're seeing today, you will be able to read into those SOPs and the methodology for the habitat evaluation and also the IBI. Next slide. All right, so we talked about how this was, a very expansive study and how we have looked at a lot of the sites on the White River, and it's the largest of its kind that we know of for one stream in a single year. And if you look at that map, I think that pretty much sums it up right away. You can see all of the sites that we sampled, all 62 of them. And this is a cumulative result. So this is every site that we did. And the first thing that jumps off the page to me right away is that 94 species. I will tell you that Kevin, Sandy, and I, as we were brainstorming this project and it finally got off the ground, we started wondering, you know, how many species will we see? And none of us guessed this high, I will say that. So we were ecstatic at the end of this project to know that we came across 94 different species. So total fish-wise, we sampled 17,232 total fish. And if you remember back to Sandy's ID space, that meant that we had to identify, count, weigh, collect scales for the game species of all these fish. So you can imagine the amount of time that we spent working on differentiating these fish species and also getting all the data we need to convey it to you guys. The last 2 points on this slide really kind of bring it home to me as well, because we see that 34.36% of all the fish we sampled on this whole project were sensitive to water pollution. 27% were tolerant, and as we move through this project, you will see where they shift, where they change, and some of those species that are mentioned. So those 5 fish pictures that you see right there, those are the top 5 sampled species, and they are listed in order. The top one that you see there is the bluegill. We sampled 1,804 bluegill total, 1,273 long ear sunfish that you see in that second photo. The third one is a spot fin shiner. The 4th species down there is a blunt-nosed minnow, and the last one is a sand shiner. On this project, we had a total of 29 sensitive species, which include the smallmouth bass, a majority of the darter species that we'll see, and 2 of the top 5 species on that list there with the long-ear sunfish and sand shiner. We sampled 20 different pollution-tolerant species, things like your common carp, blunt-nosed minnow, things like that. And blunt-nose, as you can see, is number 4 on our top 5 sampled fish list. That remaining 45 fish that we did not mention in sensitive or tolerant do not have a specific tolerance designation. Next slide. So this is a part of the presentation where we're going to start breaking it down and looking at the individual sections of the river. And this is just a way to kind of visually understand as we're going. So section 1 is what I would call the Bureau of Water Quality's home court. And I'm glad that Tim had mentioned earlier, for people that are unfamiliar with the Bureau of Water Quality, that we're located in Muncie, Indiana, established in 1972, and are one of the oldest water pollution testing facilities in the United States. So with this being our kind of our home court, we were able to give Kevin and Sandy an idea of sites that would work out for this project. Since we weren't in Anderson, where they had some of the fish kill sites and some of the more historic downstream sites, this goes into the planning process, like we talked about earlier, to where we're working so we can all get the most out of our information. So some quick highlights. We sampled 39 different species, 4,000 plus individuals. We had 46.98, so basically 47% were sensitive species. Again, that's sensitive to water pollution. The 26.97% tolerant species, so we had a lot more sensitive than tolerant species. And our top 5 species, in order to make that map large enough, I had to shrink my species down a little bit. But the number 1 sampled species was the blunt-nosed minnow. Sand shiner was number 2. Northern hogsucker, which is the sucker species on your far left at the bottom, was number 3 with 192. Central stone roller was the one to the right there in the middle. That we had 175. And rosy face shiner was the last species that we saw there. And we had 167 of those. And if you want to look at the dots on the map there, that's going to be your IBI scores, so your narrative ranking for those sites. We ended up with 3 excellent sites, so those are going to be scoring greater than 53. If you remember back to our score ranking system of a possible 60, we had 5 good sites, which range from 45 to 52, 4 fair sites, 35 to 44 for a score, and 1 very poor site that scored at 22. And the reason for that very poor there, located there in the red, that site was a unique one, to say the least. It was potentially dredged in the past, possibly a concrete dump. There was a large log jam. So there was a lot going on, but I will say that it was an outlier for this section. Next slide. And before I talk about the habitat, the picture there in your bottom, I guess if you're looking at the screen, the bottom left with the canoe, that was that site that scored very poor. So you can see I'm standing on poured concrete to take that photo. You can see the log jam in the very back, and it's sort of pooled up. It doesn't look much like a stream there, especially being a headwater area where it was as our fourth site from the headwater. So it was definitely an odd site, to say the least. Narratively, for these sites, we're going to have 7 excellents. So that's going to be a site that scores greater than 75 out of that possible 100. 4 good sites, so that's the 60 to 74 range. 1 fair, which is 45 to 59, and 1 poor, which is 30 to 44. Now, some of the issues that would potentially cause lower scores would be things like a riparian zone, silty substrate, historic channelization, any sort of bank clearing, increased erosion, and removing that traditional riffle run pool complex that you see in the bottom picture with our trucks. So it's definitely something to think about as you're going through these results. And with that, I will go ahead and pass it on to Sandy to talk to you guys about section 2.
Thanks, Drew. So section 2, if you'll notice here, just south of Indianapolis, just down to Southport Road. And if you'll think about looking at the map from Drew's section to this section, you'll notice there's quite a few more sample sites in this section. And that's because we wanted to not only hit those 303D list sampling sites, but we wanted to also resample some of the White River fish kill sites. So we ended up adding additional sites to this section. And if many of you will, are surprised when they think of Indianapolis, this is a major industrial river, but we still collected 62 species within this section of river, almost 8,000 total fish. 41% are still sensitive, with 18% being tolerant. So actually very healthy fish communities through this section of river, even with the modifications of some of the dams that go through Indianapolis. Looking at our top 5 fish species, we have bluegill here, long-eared sunfish, which is the brightly colored one there on the top, followed by green sunfish, rock bass, which is a very popular game fish species, and the northern hogsucker. And smallmouth bass was just outside of the top 5 fish species sampled. This is by far the most abundant section for game fish and rock bass, smallmouth bass, largemouth bass, even some of our catfish species of channel catfish and flathead catfish through these stretches. You can see we did have several excellent IBI sites, and then we also have some all the way through the poor category. But overall, no very poor sites through this section of river, which I think would surprise a lot of people. Next slide. And looking at habitat, once again, I think it would surprise people to realize that we actually had a lot of excellent sites through the Indianapolis area and from Anderson down. Many areas with very healthy riparian habitat, low sedimentation, which is an indicator of better habitat for especially our darters and minnows through that area. We once again had no very poor sites and no poor sites. And these are some of the photos that we had taken through the sampling these stretches. And one thing you'll want to keep track of is as we move downstream, you're going to see a shift in the percent sensitive versus the percent tolerant. That's very normal for big rivers, that as you move downstream, you do see the number of tolerant species increasing, but you'll kind of notice that as we're moving downstream also. Kevin, next slide. So now moving to section 3, this is just south of Indianapolis, moving down through Martinsville, Spencer. And I will mention, actually in the previous section, section 2, our lowest station in that station is where we actually collected the first Asian carp. We collected no Asian carp through Indianapolis, We did pick one up down on the Southport Road Station, and that was some silver carp. We collected one, but documented a couple others. So just on the south end of section 2 into section 3 and 4 is where we start seeing Asian carp appear. So in this section, we did have 61 species. So for all the sections, we had about the same number of species collected. There was no major drop off as we move downstream. We just see a shift in the type of fish communities we see. Section 3, we start seeing more of our big river species and we'll notice that here in our top 5 species. But once again, we start seeing the number of percent of sensitive species starts going down. We're down to 26%, and the number of tolerant species is increasing to 32%. Our top 5 fish species collected are the spotfin shiner, the sand shiner, the spotted bass, gizzard shad, and smallmouth buffalo. And so we're starting to see that shift into more big river species where we start seeing buffalo, gizzard shad, and bigger bodied river fish. You can see here, based on our IBI scores, we did have one very poor site. We had no excellence, but we did have 2 good sites. So once again, as you're starting to move downstream, habitat starts getting a little worse and conditions start getting a little worse, which is normal as you have more tributaries coming in, more outside influence, more sediment, and you're moving to more agricultural landscape of the state. Next slide. But still overall, our habitat was good to fair for all sites through this section. Once again, you can see some of the pictures here of other fish species we collected. Shovel-nosed sturgeon, a large flathead catfish, some long-nosed gar, definitely moving towards more big river fish species. And Kevin's gonna round out with the last sampling section.
Okay, so the section 4 of our project starts in about southern Greene County and goes all the way down the West Fork White River to where the East Fork and West Fork meet and form the White, and then from that junction all the way down to the Wabash River. And as you guys probably have seen over time, and I know Drew mentioned this, when you look at those numbers of percent sensitive and percent tolerant, you will see that the number of percent sensitive has been decreasing and the percent tolerant has been increasing. We see that because we're seeing a shift in those headwater species that are residing up north and kind of converting over to more big river species that are more tolerant. As we go to those lower sections of the river, the nutrients and sediment is accumulating as we go down from upstream. So we see that shift there. In the lower section, we collected 56 species, 3,273 fish, with our top 5 species being, going from top to bottom, Mississippi silvery minnow, spotfin shiner, bullhead minnow, freshwater drum, and short-nosed gar. When we look at the IBI scores that we calculated for these, yes, they do look a little bit bad. I noticed someone in a comment saying that they noticed that it was decreasing as you went downstream. Yes, they are lower, but when we look at historical samples in these areas, we're actually seeing increases in scores. When we looked at the White River section down south of Vincennes, historically, some of those stretches of streams have scored 14 on the IBI, and we're seeing these scores almost double. So we are seeing some improvement there. When we look at habitat for the section 4, We're seeing similar trends to we have for the other 3 sections, where we're in that fair to good category for a majority of them. We did have one excellent IB or QHEI score, the second to last site before we get to the Wabash, which that site was unlike any of the other ones in the lower white that we sampled. I was fortunate to sample it, and it kind of was like a little oasis in the lower white. But with this section 4, we did catch some interesting fish. As you can see in the pictures to the left, we caught a freshwater eel. We caught 2 of these for the whole project. One down the lower portion of the White River, or West Fork White River, and actually one just north of downtown Indianapolis off of the 16th Street bridge. We also collected a blue cat in that middle picture, and that top right is a really large freshwater drum. One of the sensitive species we collected through a large number of sites for this project. We can see in the center bottom, that's a blue sucker, which is one of our sensitive species. With Asian carp, Sandy kind of hit on it. The highest upstream site that we collected Asian carp was near Southport Road. Now there is no barrier to the north of that until you get to Harding Street, so there is the possibility that they could be up to that barrier. Most of our Asian carp that we collected were in that stretch to the west of Bloomington. With that drought conditions, like I mentioned earlier, you can see there's one site that was in the 15 to 29 range. That site was sampled during those low flow conditions, and so those Asian carp, or those silver carp, I should say, were all kind of stuck in that stretch of stream. And just like Sandy said, also, we did not collect any big head carp in any of our sampling. So that was kind of our results for the fish community. We did want to talk a little bit more about some other components of this project, one being outreach. Like Drew said at the beginning, we want to thank all the sponsors of this presentation for allowing us to present this information. In addition to this presentation, we have had several other outreach opportunities. The bottom right screen, you see there's a little QR code. We actually handed out a whole bunch of these little business cards that have information about the project. We ended up handing out about 250 of those to interested citizens, landowners, and even some of the media that we've gone through. When it comes to the media, we have done 7 media interviews. They actually have ranged from Anderson all the way down to Evansville. We've had multiple agency press releases. Surprisingly, we've had a lot of interest on the radio. We've even had a radio station in Plymouth, Indiana, nowhere near the West Fork White River, talk about our project. We've had 5 newspaper articles and 8, well, actually more than 8 now at this point. When we did this presentation, we had 8 agency social media posts. So, and one of the other things we're doing outreach-wise is trying to get the information out to everyone. As both Drew and Sandy have mentioned, we have created a story map for this project. If you have a smartphone, if you open the camera up and you focus on that QR code to the right where it says scan me, this will actually take you to the story map and actually have most of this information that we've talked about too available. So with some things that are pending, we've got the macroinvertebrate community data that we are going to hopefully in the next week or so be able to get onto the story map. In addition to that, we've got the water chemistry data. And all that information will be posted on the story map and available for people to see. The next step also for this project would be assessments for the 303D list. Those haven't been scheduled. And like I mentioned earlier, once those assessments have been made, those impairments or delistings would be on the 2022 list of impaired waters for the state of Indiana. And finally, one of our analysis that we want to run more in depth is the detailed fish community structure throughout the West Fork White River. And as Drew said at the very beginning of this presentation, we couldn't have done this without all the help of everyone in all three of our agencies and the 4 interns that we had at the time. So we wanted to acknowledge all of them and have their names up here to express our thanks for all of the effort, all the blood, sweat, and tears for getting this project done. And at that point, we are good for questions.
Well, thank you, Drew and Kevin and Sandy, and we'll dive right into the questions. And if all 3 of you could come on screen and unmute, I'll be throwing the questions your way. So first question we got, and I'm going to go in order received on the Facebook page. For sampling, did you sample over time or just a one-time baseline? Would that be Kevin?
So I guess it depends on the sampling. For fish community, we had 1 sample, unless it was a designated quality assurance sample, like Sandy said. If that was the case, then that second sample would be taken 2 weeks after the previous sample. That allows the community in that area to kind of reestablish itself from the conditions of being shocked the first time. When it comes to the sampling itself, each site, when it comes to fish community, was done over a distance reached. The calculation of the distance was 15 times the average wetted width of the river, and from that you get the theory is by having that distance, you have the ability to have a riffle, a run, and a pool within your stretch. I think that would answer it. I don't know, did I miss anything, Sandy or Drew?
I don't think so.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. Next question. I like this one. What was the measurement of the largest smallmouth bass? And where can we get results of the fish survey? I think you've already described that, but I don't know, Sandy, you want to take that one?
Yeah, so the information specifically about sport fish, I mentioned we take individual weights and lengths on those sport fish. That information will eventually make it on the Indiana DNR's Where to Fish Finder. So you'll be able to click on a access site and there will be a report tied to that access site where we sampled closest to that area. So the individual sport fish will make it there. The general information about like the fish communities will go to the story map. The largest smallmouth bass was 18.3 inches. And that was really that Anderson, Strawtown, Perkinsville area is just a smallmouth factory, and rock bass also. And this is a great area because it's, if you have a canoe or a kayak, it's a great canoe kayak area, but it's also shallow enough for wading fishing. So even if you don't have a boat, you can get out there and fish for it. But even through Indianapolis, we had some 18-inch largemouth bass in the Broad Ripple Reach, and just some surprising things of 9-inch bluegill throughout the river through Indianapolis, some 10-inch red ear sunfish. So just some amazing fishing opportunities through that Anderson all the way through. And I know Drew will plug the Muncie stretch also for some fantastic fishing.
Yeah, I was just going to include that through Muncie, we do have a lot of great fishing opportunities as well. Something that makes it nice in Muncie, as I look out my window, I can actually see the White River Greenway that runs all along the river for almost, I think it's 3 miles. And there's parking along the way, and it's all open access to the riverbank for some great shoreline fishing. And it's not uncommon, like Sandy said, to see 14+ inch smallmouth pretty much on the regular through town. and really good rock bass fishing. We see a ton of people fishing for rock bass. So it's a really good spot as well.
Okay, thanks. I know all the anglers watching are very interested in that kind of information. Next question, and I think Kevin kind of touched on this when he was talking. Is it surprising that the best sites based on fish IBI appear to be upstream and most of the poor sites are further downstream, or is that typical for a river?
When we, I guess I'll take this. When we do our sampling, especially with the sample I've done at IDEM, we tend to see that. I mean, it's dealing with that shift in the fish community, and when you've got the water flowing downstream, like I mentioned, you are seeing the accumulation of certain parameters because it's flowing from the land upstream or into the river from the land upstream. So it is fairly common to see that. But like I said, also, even though we're seeing that, I'm feeling more comforted about the fact that when we look at the historical site, we are seeing better scores than we did even, I think, less than 10 years ago. So it is common, but yeah.
Okay, thanks. Next question is, where exactly is the poor section north of Indianapolis? This person thinks they might live near there. Would that be Kevin?
I know right here on the story map, they can zoom in to see exactly where we sampled as well, if Kevin doesn't know it right offhand.
Well, I know one of them, I'm trying to remember the other one is. One of them was north of Noblesville. That stretch was very lake-like, so that's kind of why it, like Drew mentioned on that farthest upstream site, they got the very poor. When you have that lake-like condition, the community looks a little bit different than in a section that has water. I don't remember what the second one is. I'd have to look at the story. But like Drew said, and story map, where all each site is located. We've got site photos. Sites, and it actually has a section where you can go from upstream to downstream, and it will go through each individual site with the photos if people are interested in where those sites might be.
Okay. Next question. Is the percent sensitive / tolerant based on number of taxa or number of individual specimens?
Do you want me to do that one, Drew?
Yeah, you can, that's fine.
So the sensitive is taxa, and the tolerance actually is percent, so it's actually one of each.
Okay. Next question. Could the low-head dams in Marion County be stopping the Asian carp moving north?
So there have been a couple of Asian carp found above the Harding Street Dam there. If you go to the U.S. Geological Survey Asian carp website, you can actually see all reported confirmed identifications of Asian carp. And there have been 2 found above a lot of the dams in Indianapolis. They had them listed as aquaculture escapees. So I don't know exactly what that means. So whether those 2 actually got over the dams during flooding or if they were released from somewhere else, I don't really know. But it does seem at this point that, you know, at least for now, possibly the Harding Street Dam is keeping them downstream. Asian carp really do not like shallow, clean, fast-moving water. They're really a big river fish. And so what we see in a lot of times is, you know, during the flooding season, they will move upstream to spawn. And then as the water levels go back down, they move downstream. And so that's probably why we were documenting them, moving down, in the middle of the river, as opposed to being very high up, in large densities. So I'm sure that, they're pretty ubiquitous across Indiana as far as their distribution now. But for now, we have had no large incident or large numbers of individuals documented through Indianapolis.
Okay, well, I just have a follow-up on that. Would that mean that overall it would be better to resist the spread of Asian carp by taking out all the low head dams and keeping the river flowing as best as possible?
I'm not an expert on that. I think it's a good educated discussion to have, weighing the options. That was, I think, some of the thoughts behind Williams Dam in southern Indiana, was that it was preventing Asian carp from getting upstream. But, it just took them a good couple flooding years, and they've made it over top that. So they do seem to have an ability to move around over time.
Okay, well, thanks for that. Next question comes from folks in Madison County. Our friends at White River Watchers would like to know the number of sites in Madison County that had an IBI score of excellent and good.
That's probably a better one for the story map to pull those, because it does have a full list of the sites and the scores, and all of that data is located on the story map.
Okay, well, they had a parentheses too on the graph. The county was split between two screens.
Okay. They're probably talking about the sites that I had in my section as well, like the Mounds State Park area, which those all scored well. The nice thing about the map is that you can zoom into all of the sites and kind of follow it downstream and expand on anything that you'd be curious of.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, when you go to the story map and you click on a site, you can click and get the IBI information, but you can also get the individual species list for that site and the number of individuals we collected there. So there's a lot of detailed information there.
Okay, thank you. What time of day were the fish and insects collected, and does it matter?
So when we collect the fish and macroinvertebrates, they're collected just during the day. Normally our field days are from about 7 in the morning to 7 at night during the summer. So there's kind of collected in that time frame. It is a little bit different than what you may have heard with some of the impoundments where they will sample at night. But we sample for these sites during the day.
Okay, thanks. Next one is from someone in southern Indiana, a kind of long question. What scientific methodology did you use to evaluate water quality to determine the score? Related to sensitivity of certain fish to pollution, did the scope of this study include identifying what specific toxins in what specific amounts in what specific locations exist? Maybe you'll just stop there for now. There's more to the question. It's really a detailed question, but you want to start with any of those elements of the question?
You want to do it, Drew?
Yeah. So just trying to think about that question in a not a simple way to describe it, but all of those methodologies, if you go to, I know we keep saying this, we sound like a broken record, but on the story map, there is a plan of work and all the documentation that you would need to determine, to see exactly what is looked for, what parameters, and all of that information is all readily available on our website. We wanted to make sure that we were 100% transparent on that.
Okay, and another part to this question is, were the industrial and potentially other sources of toxins identified? And if not, where can citizens go to find that information?
I guess the question is, are we talking about the water still?
Well, yes, I think in terms of, toxics that are getting into waterways in the White River, yes.
So, I mean, nothing specifically was targeted. When we placed the sites, they were placed off of the specific reach themselves. Most of the stuff when it comes to toxicity, especially what Drew was talking about, is done with literature. So there was no special study done for that. If you look at the document for the index of biointegrity that's on the story map, it'll talk a little bit more about that. When it comes to the water, I mean, like I said, we didn't really target something particularly. What we collect is just that snapshot of what the river was at the time. So when that data, we're able to compile all that data, I mean, all the various parameters will be available. So if there's something in particular that someone is looking for, then if that parameter was run, then they'd have the ability to see that.
Okay. Were mussels collected for analysis, and do we see any indication the endangered or threatened populations are increasing?
We didn't directly do any mussel surveys for this project, but throughout the entire stretch, I know we did run across a lot of different mussel species. So like I said, we didn't do a specific study on those, but we did look and see them occasionally as we were walking through. But no, mussels were not a main aspect of this project.
Okay. Another question, are there citizen science opportunities to help observe or collect data to help with these objectives moving forward? For example, kayakers who would already be on the river?
And I think there are a couple different things you can do. I don't know if Jill Hoffman's on the talk or not, but with the White River Alliance, they're putting together a citizen scientist kind of sampling program. At IDEM, we've got Hoosier River Watch, where it's a program involving citizen scientists, and they learn about taking certain samples. They actually look at the macroinvertebrates at some of the sites, so that could be potentially another opportunity for someone who would be interested. I know they do workshops. I don't know how they currently are doing that with the current COVID situation, but that would be an opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and related to River Watch, is that program still working with junior high schools?
I think it just depends on who is trained. I don't really dabble in that as much as I probably should, but I know that they put out newsletters and stuff like that, and I think they even have a website that would give contact information if someone were to be interested and have that conversation.
Okay. Still more questions coming in. These are some good questions. This is from Citizens Energy, who asked if there are any plans to replicate the study in future years. In 4 years, Citizens Energy will complete the Dig Indy tunnel system, which is designed to prevent up to 99% of combined sewer overflows along the White River in Marion County. Citizens would be interested in seeing a follow-up study of the river sometime after Dig Indy is completed.
I would be more than happy to do the project again. It was great. Now Kevin might say differently, just because he was kind of the logistics guy.
Yeah. I spent probably a good half of last year.
So Kevin,
around two. It's Kevin's fault.
Well, Kevin, IDEM has a sampling circuit, right, around the state. So when would you, what's your kind of double back time on your rivers? What's your?
So, so when we did this project, it coincided with our probabilistic monitoring sampling, which is a 9-year rotation that covers the whole entire state. So it would be, unless something were to change, it would be 9 years from last year. So what, 2029? But I know there has been talks amongst the three of us of hopefully in the future replicating this study, maybe not necessarily in the White River, but in other portions of the state if possible.
Mm-hmm. Well, that sounds good. I think implied in their question is that, you know, your current study really is kind of a baseline for the before and after of the Dig Indy project. So having the after data would be very helpful.
Yeah, and we should even thank citizens. One of our sites was on their property, and they gave us access to the river. Actually, we could literally drive straight to the river, which is a very rare thing, especially when the river gets big.
Mm-hmm. Well, and some of the posts here are just compliments for all the work you folks have done. So I wanted to relay those to you. We've gotten several of those. Somebody told us that they caught a 19-inch smallmouth just east of Morrow's Meadows Park in Yorktown. I don't know why they're disclosing that, but
Good fish.
Oh, here's a good one. Do you recommend eating those aforementioned smallmouth bass fished from the river?
So with the fish consumption, the easiest thing to do is actually, and we're gonna sound like a broken record again, on the story map, there's a link to the fish consumption advisory for the state. It actually, if you click that, it leads to their separate kind of online app where you can actually click individual sections of the river, and not necessarily just the White River, but areas throughout the whole state. And it would have the recommendations for both the general and sensitive populations. So off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you, I don't know if Sandy could, but I think the easiest thing to do is to direct people to that.
Yeah, there are some recommendations on there. I think most of them are involved with the channel catfish. And I think a lot of it's 1 meal a week or something similar to that, but definitely check out the fish consumption website. That gives a lot of information about, you know, who is a sensitive population, who is not. You know, Tim, you probably have a lot more to say about smallmouth bass being harvested more than fish consumption. You know, so, you know, definitely just check out the story map on that information.
Okay, thanks for that. Somebody did note that they should, people catching smallmouth should just kiss them and let them go. So that's one way you don't have to worry about the consumption issue. Hey, just a quick note here. We're getting close to our scheduled end time of 2:15, and we'd be happy to keep the program open for a while if our presenters want to stay on, because there's a lot more questions, but it's really up to your schedules. And also want to acknowledge my colleagues at the Hoosier Environmental Council who work on our Mounds Greenway project. Jenny Jenkins, our special projects coordinator, and she's did all the logistics getting this organized. And Bob Weaver, our Mounds Greenway campaign manager. Thank you both for your work. And for the viewers, find more about the Mounds Greenway at moundsgreenway.org. That's a proposal for a linear park and trail system along the river from Muncie to Anderson. And all of us are happy to answer more questions and talk to you about the Greenway at by email or telephone. So Kevin, Sandy, and Drew, You want to hang around a little while longer? We still have 80 people on the program.
Yeah, we can
Sure.
stay on a little longer.
Yeah,
Okay.
and then if there's any other questions, Tim, if you want to compile those, you could also send those to them and we can kind of dive in a little deeper to some of those responses and send them back to you to post in the comments.
Sure, we're glad to do that. Okay, well, just, you know, let us know if you need to break away. And so we'll go a little while longer. Next question is, I assume this would be a good one for Drew. Are there plans to remove some of the old dams on the river, and how does that affect water quality?
Yeah, so we've actually had 2 dams removed on White River. I don't know if the person has been up this way recently, but the McCullough Park Dam was removed, and also the old Steel and Wire Mill Dam off of East Jackson was removed. So this is the first year that we've had a chance to sample post-removal, and the site scores were fantastic. I forget exactly what they were, but we saw some species we had never sampled in those reaches just because the habitat was now available for them. Some of the darters and some of the smaller fish species that might be potentially using those riffles for habitat that were not available because they were in lake-like conditions. As far as the other dams go, the one at the treatment plant that's downstream, like kind of as you're heading out of town, which is where the pollution control facility is, that dam was turned into a modified riffle. So we also have seen fish coming over that dam a little easier as opposed to the others that are still intact. Don't have any sort of news, I guess, on any of the other dams through my section, but with those 2 coming out, it was very exciting to see the stuff that we saw and the changes that we've seen in 1 year. And I look forward to sampling for the following years to see how everything else rebounds. But I know some people were concerned about not finding smallmouth bass in those areas, or, you know, other fish they would fish for, and we found them. They're just in a little different spot as opposed to where they were before. And luckily, like I'd mentioned, we have the White River Greenway that runs right through town. So if you were fishing at point A, you could probably walk a little bit further downstream or upstream and find another pool that's just loaded with smallies.
Okay, and I do know that Indianapolis Power and Light was planning to remove their dam in at Eagle Valley in Martinsville. I don't know if that was going on while you guys were out on the river.
It hadn't happened yet.
Okay.
It may have helped us a little bit with the dry conditions, but turned a boat site into a canoe site, which was a little bit of a challenge. But no, to my knowledge, it was not out yet.
Okay. Next question, how can we help our score continue to show improvement?
So one way, and this is something that we kind of encourage when we do other projects at IDEM, is to get involved with watershed groups. There's the possibility of working with them, maybe get best management practices installed. But that would probably be a starting point, is to get involved with one of those groups.
Okay. We'll have another question on that in a minute. From the Madison County folks again, did the fish restocking efforts post 1999 fish kill seem to have kept carp populations lower?
I don't think so. I think the stocking was more about getting sport fish back out into the river as quickly as possible to allow, you know, angling opportunities to recover quickly, because not only is that a recreational activity, it's also a financial one. You know, there's several guide services around, there's several bait shops, there's several canoe liveries and things like that. And so part of it was to kind of get people back to using the river as quickly as possible. The reason that, you know, non-game fish were not stocked is just because we cannot raise those in hatchery facilities. And the hope was that they would just recolonize from the tributaries through that area. Indiana DNR did a lot of monitoring following that. They did surveys every year for the first couple years, and then it went to every other year. I worked on the project in 2011 where we kind of did a big, you know, resampling of all those sites from the original fish kill. And at that time, we had a reference section that was above the fish kill, and then we had the total fish kill area, and then we had the partial. And that total fish kill area and the partial area were, the same as the reference site. So the recovery from that fish kill was actually pretty quick. Within a couple years, a lot of the fish communities had returned.
Okay. And to the several questions that we've touched on about citizen science and volunteer assistance, our partners at White River Alliance have noted that they have a new volunteer sampling program they're working on in the Marion Hamilton County area. So you can reach out to Jill Hoffman at White River Alliance for more information about that. You can their website's easily findable, and they've posted their email on the Facebook questions page there. So thanks, Jill, for that info. Another question, who do we contact if we come across folks harvesting freshwater mussels?
I believe that would be the the law enforcement with Indiana DNR. That would be considered poaching. And they have a TIPS hotline that you could call, or your local conservation agent. Okay,
and that's readily available on DNR's website, right? That contact info?
Yep,
okay.
Absolutely.
Let's see, what else here? Somebody pointed out Friends of White River has consumption info on their page. They're one of our sponsors for the program. We've corrected the story map link and some thank yous and appreciation for your work. And here's another question about smallmouth. How many years do you think it would take to grow a 20-inch smallmouth in the White River?
They take about 9 to 10 years, actually. It's pretty amazing how long-lived these fish can be out in the rivers. When people talk about, water quality and fishing and stuff like that, we still see fish up, smallmouth bass living 9, 10 years out there in the river. Some of our catfish are probably over 30 years old out there. So it's really neat to see those big old fish out there.
Okay. And there's a couple others here, and we're about to the end, I think, of the questions we have so far. One question is, what do you attribute the poor to very poor sections, their water quality or IBI to? What do you attribute the cause of that?
It could be a lot of things. I mean, once we do the assessments, we'll look at them a little bit more closely. Judging my experience, especially in that lower portion of the river, a big thing we see is erosion, stream bank erosion. We see farming up until pretty much the river. I think there was one instance that I was boating down the lower part of the river, and I was amazed that the farmer somehow didn't fall into the river. He was that close. But especially that lower stretch, the habitat's just so much different than the headwaters, and they score good scores, but it's just, I mean, one we're looking at a larger distance in that score, but it's overall just a different world kind of than the headwater.
Okay, and farm field runoff, is that a problem in the White River?
We'd have to look at the data. Off the top of my head, I couldn't pinpoint that for you.
Okay, and another question about the program being recorded. I believe we are recording it. So we will make this available, and we'll post all that information where to find it on the Mounds Greenway Facebook page, and Mounds Greenway website at moundsgreenway.org. So we'll have all that and the links to your study as well. I think we've pretty much reached the end here. So if any of you have any thoughts you'd like to add in conclusion? Somebody didn't ask something they should have?
Keep checking out the story map, because Kevin and IDEM are adding data on there still. And so there is information being added to the story map continuously.
Yeah, and besides that, I just want to thank all the interest. I mean, I think when we did this project, we didn't expect it to have as big of an interest as it did. But it's been really cool, especially during sampling, stopping and talking to people and seeing people even enjoy the resource that we have with the White River.
Mm-hmm. It is truly a great resource, and we appreciate what all of you are doing and your colleagues at the agencies. And it's I think the river's finally getting starting to get the attention it deserves from more than just those people who are out on it at fishing or paddling or swimming. And with the White River Vision Plan in Marion, Hamilton County, and the Partners for the White River Project, all up and down the river, people are taking note of what a great resource it is. And so thanks for all your work. Be happy to have you come back when you have more information you'd like to report. And we'd like to again say thanks to everybody for joining us today, and to our sponsors, White River Alliance, Two Forks Guide Service, the DNR, White River Watchers, Friends of White River, Heart of the River, and Robert Cooper Audubon, all great groups that are part of the crowd that's working to help protect the river. So thank you again for joining us, and check for posting of the links and the recording and the slides, and we'll have all that available for everybody. So thanks again for joining.